If you gave me a radio transmitter and said, here's the frequency of that caller, you can go out and see if you can shoot that deer, I know you can't do it. We have the ability to drop a caller, but our technicians have to get within a couple hundred yards of those deer. And sometimes it'll take them a week or more before they can get within 200 yards of deer. And they have it, first of all, we give them the GPS locations and say, okay, here's the last location of the deer. And they go out there, and then they have a receiver that they can listen to the signal and walk in on that deer. But they have to get within a couple hundred yards where they send a signal that causes the caller to drop off. And they may spend a week trying to get up on that deer. If you can't do that with all that technology, that's 200 yards isn't even within a rifle shot in Pennsylvania.
All right, Dr. Duane Diefenbach, I'm very happy to be at Penn State right now. Thank you for having us.
Thanks for coming. I think we'll have a fun conversation.
Yeah, definitely. This is my first time in Pennsylvania. I'm impressed. We were talking about it off camera a second ago. Very beautiful state so far. Very, very beautiful. Jacob, how are you liking it?
Oh, I'm doing well. It's been up here a few times, but Dr. Duane, I want to get into specifics of your background to kind of set the tone for this conversation. Can you go into your background when it comes to doing research in the whitetail space, but also how you get associated with Penn State and being an adjunct professor here?
Sure. So I started in 1999. The Pennsylvania Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit is a cooperative of Penn State, the Pennsylvania Game Commission, our Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. We have separate agencies for fish and wildlife, as well as USGS and a couple of other organizations. So it's a cooperative that we have three scientists here at Penn State, and the state agencies support fish and wildlife research. So, of course, Pennsylvania is an important species in Pennsylvania, and of course, so I've been doing deer research since 2000. We started out studying fawn survival, looked at buck movements, dispersal movements, female movements, harvest rates, and since 2013, my current research is a long-term study trying to look at the interaction of soil conditions, plant competition, and deer herbivory on our understory plant communities in our forests, because Pennsylvania is, you know, its name means Penn's woods, right? So parts of Pennsylvania are 90+% forested. So we've answered lots of questions about the biology of deer, you know, their movements and survival rates and that sort of behavior. Another important question is, what's their role in our forest communities, especially plant communities? Because if you have too many deer, you can have severe problems with forest tree regeneration. And so this latest study, like I said, started in 2013, so it's been going over a decade now, and we'll be wrapping up in this coming year, is trying to look at, we know deer are important, we know soils are important, we know that vegetation, there's competition just within vegetation, but how do those three factors interact and what's most important? So I really see that as sort of the capstone of my career. Yeah, so it's been a long ride, right? So over 25 years of doing white-tailed deer research.
One of the reasons I wanted to come up here and talk to you is because we've had several podcasts that we've done in the past with guys like Dr. Bronson Strickland of Mississippi State, among a couple others who have done GPS research on white-tailed deer. Most of the time, pretty much all those studies actually, have been in parts of Mississippi along the, the Big Black River, Little Black River, where it's maybe rolling hills. It's usually flat land. There's a little bit of agriculture involved. And up here with the Penn State study that y'all have been doing, it's big woods and it's mountains. And that's just unique. We haven't really got to see that yet. And you guys were some of the first that put out information on like buck movements, where you put out videos that showed points like of how this buck was moving around this ridge system. It was fascinating. And I think the first videos like that you put out were maybe around 2014 or so. I remember seeing those blog posts or seeing those going around the internet, and it absolutely blew my mind. So this podcast has been kind of a long time coming for us. So I'm really excited to talk about that. And one of the first things I want to get into is y'all's findings around how deer like to move in terrain. And I know that you're a hunter as well, so I think I want to start off by saying, when you first got into this study, what were some of the questions that you personally were interested in answering about how deer navigate these mountains and big woods?
Well, to be honest, this whole information and things that insights I've gained are really just collateral information, right? Was not the primary purpose, was to study buck movements. But we needed to know how many deer are there, some of their basic population dynamics. But the technology today, this is just a side benefit of the data that you can collect. Because when I started 25 years ago, it was pretty much all VHF transmitters, which means someone has to go out there with a receiver and an antenna and go to at least 2 or 3 different locations and figure out, okay, what direction is that? And from that information, you can calculate, you can triangulate on where the deer is. And it's not accurate. And if you had a technician working full time, you'd be happy if you got 20 locations on a single deer in a month. Well, with the technology today that we have, I can get 20 locations in an hour if I want. And so, I'm not sure we necessarily came in with burning questions to ask. It was just that the technology is there and we have the opportunity to collect the data to find out. I would say in Pennsylvania, the hunting season where most deer are killed is our rifle season, which is about 2 weeks long. Well, 12 to 14 days. The seasons have changed a little bit over the years. But it's basically a 2-week rifle season where the majority of the deer are harvested. And on these study areas that we have 4 study areas, we were interested in understanding how many deer were killed, where they were killed, that sort of thing. And so we were interested in what deer movements were doing and their survival during that rifle season in response to hunting. And so we were able to, with this new technology, get a location every 20 minutes during those 2 weeks. And that's the movies that you're referring to, right? So that really opened up some insights. And I would almost say I had some basic idea of what they might be doing, but I really didn't even know what questions to ask.
Okay.
Because I'd never followed a deer, right? So the first thing you have to do in science is observe something, right? So we've never observed, I hadn't anyway, the movements of a single deer every 20 minutes for 2 weeks. So at that point, you don't even know what questions to ask. You can say, well, we can collect some data and see what happens. So, so that's where that all started.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And also, let's start by talking about one of your most famous deer. Because you guys, to disseminate the information, y'all started writing blog posts and putting information out there. And you were, in several of those blog posts, you mentioned a certain buck. We were talking about it a little bit before we got started. So what number was he again?
Yeah, so we call him Buck 8917, so that was his ear tag number.
Okay.
And you want the story of Buck 8917.
Oh, yeah.
So Of course, we trap our deer in January through March. That's the easiest time to catch deer. There's some snow on the ground. The best time to catch deer is 6 inches of snow on the ground because it's hard to find acorns, and cold temperatures, and they'll come into your traps. And so we caught this deer in the winter and followed him. And most adult deer, there's always exceptions, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it over this podcast. But most deer, their home range is just a blob on the landscape, right? It's an oval or a circle, basically. And this guy clearly had a home range, just this blob on the landscape. And he made this trip, I think it was in June, like 2 miles out of his home range to this spot up on this ridge, and then came back and spent his time there. And so I think we followed him for a couple of years. And in the fall, and I know it was winter, he was in one of our most remote locations. We have 4 study areas, 2 up north in the Allegheny Plateau, and 2 are just south here of State College, where we are in what we call the Ridge and Valley. So long linear ridges that are completely forested, and in the valleys is where ag and human developments are. And these are large areas, 25 to 40 square miles, that are 95% more forested. And this one was way back there. And it had snowed, and of course when a deer dies, those collars will send us a signal, because once the collar stops moving, that triggers it to send a signal to the satellite and let us know that, hey, there's a potential mortality here. And it had snowed wicked bad. The techs could not get to that deer for like a day and a half. But where they found him was that spot that he had not visited for like 2 years. So for some reason, he had this home range, traveled like 2 miles away, had to go up over a ridge, up the other side, up onto the ridge, and that's where they found him dead. He was not killed by coyotes. He was scavenged by coyotes. But because of the bad weather, the coyotes, they eat all the evidence, right? So we couldn't really determine what killed him. But I think that was fascinating for lots of readers. Like, why would this buck establish a home range? Because we've studied deer dispersal, and young deer, 70 to 80% of males, when they're a year to year and a half, will disperse from where they were born, and they disperse in like 12 to 24 hours, and they set up a new home range, and they stay there the rest of their lives. And like I said, it's usually just if you plotted all the dots, it's just this blob on the landscape. But why would this guy go to this spot and then almost 2 years later go to that same spot and die? I can guess at some things. I mean, maybe that was his natal home range. Area where he was born, I have no idea. We had no idea why he died at the time, but then I was going back through our data, and we happened to have 2 bucks in that area radio collared. And for some reason, I plotted both of those bucks' movements, and you could see that both those bucks were right next to each other. And these GPS collars are quite accurate. Most of the time, they're within about 6 feet of the actual location. And so we knew these 2 bucks were together, and I suspect they were competing, sparring. And I think that guy was injured. Buck 8917 was injured and headed off to that mountain, and that's where he died. So it's a fascinating story because there's so many questions that we'll never answer about him. And and the technology isn't there to necessarily get the answers to future buck 8917s, because ideally, what would you want to know? You'd want to know, where was he born, and follow him from birth all the way till death, and the technology's not there yet, right? We can catch a fawn that's a few hours old now, because we'll put radio collars on the females and we can tell when they give birth. We can go in and catch the fawn, put a radio collar on the fawn, but that has to be designed to expand with their growth, and so they only last about a year. And GPS technology for fawn collars is just getting going. And so we can follow a fawn for 6 months to a year at best, and then we're done because the collar's dead unless you can catch them again, but that's a rarity. So yeah, to get at those types of stories, we're just not there yet.
How are you guys catching these deer?
Well, in these large tracts of forest, primarily what we use are called clover traps. And what would you think you'd bait a clover trap with?
Probably corn or clover. I don't know.
Yeah, so it's a clover with a capital C because the guy who designed its name was Clover. So you don't bait it with clover. We bait it with corn. And just shelled corn is the best bait. I mean, we've tried, what do they call it, deer cocaine, molasses, salt, all sorts of stuff. And basically, they need to be hungry, and corn is easy to transport. So and a clover trap is basically a walk-in trap, right? So it's a metal frame, it's got netting on it. They walk in one end, they trip, there's a trip wire, and then a netted gate falls down behind them, and they're in the trap. And then that's where you get, young college students to put on a hockey mask and run in and tackle the deer. Our crews get really good at it. If it's not a deer that we want to collar, they can go in there, put ear tag, catch it, restrain it, put ear tags in it, and let it go in under 5 minutes. When the crews get really good at it, they've caught a bunch of deer, they can catch a deer, put in ear tags, fit it with a radio collar in probably 15 minutes and let it go. So that's the bread and butter way of catching deer. Later in the season, we'll also use rocket nets. Those are much more exciting, right? So that literally it shoots a rocket that carries like a 40 by 20 or 40 by 30 net and shoots it over the deer, so you can catch multiple deer at once. But it takes a lot of work, right? You gotta set up bait, monitor that with cameras, and then the crew will go out there at night and sit there, and the deer may not show up, or the wind will blow the wrong way. So it's not as cost effective. But if we have small openings in the forest, we can use rocket nets. If we're in more open habitat, we have large drop nets that are like 80 or 90 feet square, and have a remote trigger that can drop the net. But it takes a lot of work to set those up. Yeah, but you can catch a lot of deer at once.
That sounds fun. That sounds like
catch and release deer hunting.
Yeah, right. I want to talk about home ranges and kind of dig into home ranges. You mentioned that when you look at these deer on a map, when you plot out their home range, it's kind of like a blob on the landscape. One thing that I'm curious about, again, in a mountainous bigwood setting, is what are those home ranges usually centered around, if anything?
Yeah, so there's a couple things. First, I'd like to mention that home range size varies quite a bit in Pennsylvania where you are. So if we're down in an ag area with good soils, a female might have a home range of a couple hundred acres, and a male wouldn't be much bigger than that. Even during the rut, he would still be under a square mile. But in what we call the big woods in Pennsylvania, Those are primarily forested, like 90 to 100% forested. The soils are not as good, so there's not as much food. And so the average home range will be about a square mile for males and females outside the breeding season. During the breeding season, then, those male home ranges might expand to 3-4 times, right? 3, 4, maybe even 5 square miles. Those home ranges, so the rule of thumb in the big woods of Pennsylvania is 1 square mile, except during the rut. Those home ranges aren't necessarily centered on anything, but it's more the boundaries. So roads, streams, power lines, lots of examples where you can see, there might be a stream and a road, and the home range is sort of centered in between. We had one doe, there was a power line that went up, and that was the western edge of her home range. And it's not that the power line was an impediment to movement or had any negative effect anyway. It's just natural for animals to pick up some feature as a boundary. So, a stream, a power line, right, is an abrupt difference between forested and brushy habitat. So it's really more the boundaries. We'll have bucks that are on very tip-top of a ridge. I mean, there isn't even a water source up there, but they obviously are getting access to water somehow. There's no stream or anything. Usually if their home range encompasses a road, they don't live as long, so the smarter deer have roads as the boundary of their home range.
All right, guys, we got another in-the-field tip for you today. One thing we're doing right now while we're out here scouting is looking at overlooked spots and overlooked by us. One thing we always do while we're in the field is using our tracker on OnX Hunt to be able to not only see where we've gone, but where we haven't been, and that's what we're gonna go look at. So today, we're actually gonna work up into a drainage that we haven't been to before. We've walked all around it, but we haven't been up in it. And again, it's a very important factor of using the tracker so you can see where you have been and where you haven't. A lot of times those places you haven't been is your overlooked spots. So if you wanna try OnX Hunt, you can download OnX Hunt today and use the code SOUTHERN and save 20% on your membership.
If you want to get a head start on deer season, you can go out and you can actually scout feed trees in summer. This is something we've been talking about on the podcast quite a bit lately. Today I'm out here, I've got a pair of Vortex Viper HDs. This is a great pair of binoculars for this. And what we're doing is we're just looking up into these oak trees, looking to see if we can see the little acorn buds on the limbs. So as summer goes on, it's going to get easier and easier to see those buds as they get larger. A tip for that is when you're looking up in the tree, you want to find a limb that's daylighted. It's just nothing but daylight behind it. You're looking at an isolated limb, and you're just going to want to pick that thing apart with a good pair of binos like these that are clear. I like to use a trekking pole and actually brace the binos on the trekking pole and sit down underneath that tree and really look at it for a while. So if you want to get a head start scouting feed trees this summer, go get you a pair of Vortex binoculars. Head on over to eurooptic.com. Use the code SOUTHERN10 and it's going to get you a discount on these binoculars or any other optics that Vortex sells.
Hey guys, it's Jake. We got a quick tip for you in this podcast. One thing I've been working on over the last year is trying to figure out how to be less bulky really while saddle hunting and mobile whitetail hunting. And the biggest issue I always had was I really liked really large packs, and the problem was outside of certain points of the season, like when it got really cold, I never used the full capacity of some of those really big backpacks. And one thing I started doing is using a smaller pack that has a lot more expandable capacity, so you can still pack a lot of stuff if you need to, but it's also very streamlined. It's super easy to go in and out of the woods with, especially during early season or just when you're not packing a lot of cold weather gear. This is the Latitude Ranger 22. I used this all last season, and I could pack a surprising amount of gear in that pack, specifically a bunch of cold weather gear, both bibs, jackets, extra layers, along with a platform, or when I was hybrid hunting with a small little lock-on, having a small lock-on on here as well, along with my sticks. And this backpack works really well with that. So if you're in the market for a new backpack and you're trying to streamline what you're doing, I'd really highly recommend looking at the Ranger 22 from Latitude Outdoors. And you can check out the Ranger 22 at latitudeoutdoors.com. All right, guys, it's the dog days of summer. Getting into August here, super hot here in the Deep South. Just wrapped up doing a podcast. We're actually out here at the pond fishing and working with the dogs. And one thing super important for us this time of the year is having something that we can wear that's lightweight, breathable, but also dries really quick. And one shirt we've come to love for these conditions is the Tibby Everyday Button-Down shirt from Mossy Oak. So speak about quick drying. Weller, the small mudslingers, just came over and shook water on me about 5 minutes ago, and the shirt's already dry. So again, this is a fantastic shirt. Whether you're going to church, you're going scouting, hang out this summer with family, or going out in the town, it's a fantastic shirt that's super lightweight and comfortable, especially with a 4-way stretch. You can check out the Tibby shirt at mossyoak.com.
That's interesting. There was a study done at Auburn a couple years ago on a couple different wildlife management areas and properties around Alabama, and we got access to that data, and I plotted it out in a GIS system, and we were able to look at these deer, and it actually very much mirrored what you just said. You would find that these deer would have just usually like a main road, even on the WMA, even a dirt road, that they wouldn't go past. Like we had 2 deer that we looked at one time on this particular WMA, and there was a ridge kind of between their home ranges where they spent the most time, and that ridge had a road on it. And they would both go right up to that road, and they never crossed it whenever we were looking at it. And that was interesting. Now down there, it's much more diverse habitat. There's clear cuts, there's hardwood SMZs, there's some upland forest, there's pine savanna that they manage for longleaf. So it's much more of a mosaic across the landscape. Up here in the big wood setting, is it kind of I wouldn't say it's not a monoculture because there's multiple different trees up there, but it's all like oak hickory. Is everything very similar, or do you still have a patchwork in these big woods up here of different habitat types?
Well, we have, as I mentioned, there's 2 study areas up north, and those are in northern hardwoods. So yellow birch, sugar maple, red maple, beech are the predominant tree species. Some oaks, not a lot. Our 2 southern study areas are in what we would call an oak hickory or an oak heath habitat. So the overstories dominate by chestnut oak on the ridge tops, red oak and maybe white oak in deeper soils, yellow poplar, hickory. The understory, especially on the ridge tops, is dominated by heath, so like blueberry, huckleberry, mountain laurel, which is our state flower. It's very similar to rhododendron. We do have rhododendron that's usually on north-facing slopes along streams, but mountain laurel covers large part of the understory. So it's horrible to walk through, right? So it can get about 8-9 feet high, and it just has thick, gnarly stems. I think it's great hiding cover for deer. But so yes, in the southern part, so our ridges are forested. It can be homogeneous, but again, these are state forests that are managed, and there's timber harvesting going on. So the different age structures that you get in the forest can influence where deer are. Obviously, when you get clear cuts that are 4 to 6 years old, there's gobs of food, and deer are going to spend a lot of time in there. We also notice in the wintertime south-facing slopes that have early successional food, or there's conifer cover that has less deep snow. There is some variation in habitat that deer use. But, and then up north, same thing. Up north, there's a lot more timber harvesting going on because we have black cherry, which is very valuable. And so there's quite a mosaic in our northern study areas. And so you'll see variation in habitat use by deer related to the stand age. But, from the standpoint of the hunting season, I mean, there's lots of food in the fall, and especially if there's an acorn mast, lots of mast available. I think it's challenging to hunt because what do you see? It's just trees, 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 trees. It's not, you don't have these sharp edges like you do in an ag area where you've got ag, or you might have lots of ag connected by some forest that might funnel deer for movements and stuff. You really don't have that. So it is a challenge, I think, to quote unquote pattern deer, much more so in these large tracts of forest.
Yeah, and I want to talk about the food source situation up here a little bit more, but before we get to that, I wanted to flip the home range conversation back over to terrain. One thing that you wrote in some of these blog posts is that one thing that stuck out to you about a lot of these deer was that it was hard to decipher any one thing that they seemed like they wanted to hold on, which is kind of what you just said a second ago. But in the blog post, you made the point, some of them seemed to like to live on the steep side slopes, some of them lived on the tops of the ridges, and some of them like to live way down in the valleys. And again, talking the big woods here. So throughout your research, you never really saw anything terrain-wise that deer just really favored as far as a home range?
In terms of where they establish a home range, no, you can find them anywhere. You can find them, some of them have their home range smack dab on top of the ridge. Some are down, on side slopes. Steep side slopes, not so much, but yeah, you can find deer almost anywhere. In fact, I had a student who was doing camera trap. She had cameras spread out all over our southern study areas. Well, actually all 4 study areas. But basically, it was like 97% of her cameras, she got a picture of a deer. Wherever she put a camera, she got a picture of a deer. So they are everywhere. They like some places better than others, but basically there's deer everywhere across the landscape. The trick, I think, is the rifle season. So archery season, we have a lot more participation in the archery season than we did, even 10 years ago. But there's not enough that it disturbs deer behavior that I could detect from watching the movements of these deer. There's nothing, you couldn't, if I didn't tell you what time of the year it was, you wouldn't know whether it's July or September or October. Of course, late October and November, when the rut cuts in, you know what time of year it is. But so it's the rifle season that terrain influences deer movements. And I don't want to put it out there that deer are smart. It's some deer get lucky, right? So they get disturbed and they run to a spot, and that spot happens to be a place where there's less likely to be a hunter. And so deer learn that, okay, when there's this disturbance, I'm going to run there and set up. And, I've looked at lots of movements of our deer, and if you go on the Deer-Forest blog, you can see lots of movies that I've made that show this. There's certain key features that serve as a good hiding spot, right? So it's a steep slope, and especially a pattern that pops up with bucks is that it's not really a ridge top, but a high spot with a near steep terrain. So it could be a plateau, but they're right on the edge where that plateau drops off. Or it could be in our ridge and valley, it could be on top of the ridge, but there's a very steep slope. And oftentimes the steep slope is to the east, and it may not be quite as steep to the west. And I think the advantage there is that there's wind is coming from westerly direction, so they can sense things on the non-steep slope through scent, and the steep slope is sort of an escape hatch, or if there's something coming up there, there's no way that it can't hear you coming. But they can literally jump off that little lip of wherever that high spot, go down that steep slope, and they'll be 300 yards away from you in 15 seconds. So that makes it very difficult to sneak up on some of these bucks. And they know when things are happening. So a lot of them are in this hiding spot by 5 o'clock in the morning. And it's not legal shooting hours till about 7 during our rifle season. So they're there in their hiding spot, bedded down, and they'll stay there till 10, 12 o'clock, noon, and then you'll see those movements pick up in the afternoon, and by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there was the one doe I call Hillside Doe because 5 a.m. she'd be in her hiding spot, really steep spot high up on the edge of the ridge, usually moving 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, right, it's shooting hours are done around 5. She's already walking down in the bottom around the camps and stuff. And then the next morning she does the same thing. 5 o'clock in the morning, she's back up in her hiding spot, sits there all morning, and then might start moving in the afternoon. And just repeat that for 12 days till the hunting season's over.
And to me, this is so fascinating because of the conditioning standpoint. If they survive that initial, season, that gun season, and survive getting bumped and finding an area that they are comfortable in and they're not getting bumped out, or they're not smelling in any kind of humans, they're not seeing anybody. It's almost like just classic conditioning. That's that spot they can go to and be safe. And you're seeing this with bucks and does in these areas during the very high pressure gun seasons. And commonality between steep terrain with, again, the predominant wind direction, so they can smell anything on the less steep side, but also have a quick access path off the steep side if they need to. One question I have is access. Most of this ground that you're studying, where they're going up higher in elevation, is most of the access points for hunters coming from down low working up, or is there access points on top of a lot of these ridges as well that these deer are spending time on?
Yeah, so our study is all on public land, no unrestricted access, so anyone can hunt. Of course, in Pennsylvania, if you buy a hunting license, with that hunting license comes a buck tag, right? And we have antler point restrictions, which I'm sure we'll get into. And then our doe tags are allocated first come, first serve with allocations by management unit. And in addition, we have a deer management assistance program where landowners can have specific areas where they have extra tags, and that's part of our research too. So the Bureau of Forestry, it's a program administered by the Game Commission. The Bureau of Forestry develops a management plan to get additional tags for certain areas. So it's unrestricted access by hunters, and so the roads are driven by topography, right? So in the Ridge and Valley, either you have roads in the valleys, and then periodically you'll have roads that go up over the ridges or through gaps. So so there are ways to drive to the top of the ridge, but not everywhere. And in the other study area up on the plateau, it's a little bit different. So it's still steep terrain, just as steep as our southern ridge and valley region, but it's a plateau with dissected drainages, right? So you can have roads on top, and you might have a road that goes down a drainage. But again, those steep side slopes can be tough access, and there's areas that you can easily get a half a mile or more from a road. So that's the type of hunting access that's there.
So in some areas there is access where you could walk out a ridge system, but in some of the study areas where you're seeing these bucks and these does getting up on elevation to their safe area up top, did you ever look at similarities if any of those ridge systems had a road system on top of it as well?
Well, our ridge and valley rarely has roads across the ridge because those ridges at the top might be very narrow. So that really doesn't have. They usually just go up and over or through a gap. Yeah. So access is a limit. I mean, I can talk about Buck 8917 because I walked up to his hiding spot, and my wife and dogs, we decided to take a hike on a Sunday, and the only thing I can say is that you don't want to walk into that place in the dark because it's steep. It's we have talus slopes where it's very rocky, just almost bare rock. So it's really tough. I wouldn't want to walk in the dark. I think what you'd have to do is you could start at daylight or maybe a little bit before dark and at the shallow part, but once it gets steep, you could hike up there, but I guarantee you're not going to get there for an hour at best after hunting hours start, at best. You could hunt there during the day and maybe sit up on that ridge and maybe catch a deer that's moving along the ridge in the afternoon, but you're going to have to head out around 3:30 in the afternoon because there's no way you want to walk down trying to carry your rifle or dragging your deer out. It is really steep. So, and I wrote a blog post about if I were going to hunt Buck 8917, this is how I do it. And there are other guys that made similar comments. They said, yeah, that was when I was younger. That was my strategy, and I was very successful. But again, you have to give up those optimal hours, right? The first hour after dawn, after sunrise and legal shooting hours, and the last hour before shooting hours end. You basically have to give that up because that's the time that you're walking in and out of there.
Interesting. So, and that's another thing that's fascinating about this because with us being in the deep south, there's some mountain systems that we've hunted, like the lower Appalachian Mountains, Appalachian. How do we say it again? Appalachian. People from North Carolina, Tennessee get real upset if you don't say it correctly. But really rugged, steep areas. And there's a lot of similarities across a lot of the southeast because, again, we live 15 hours almost from here. But there's a lot of similarities to like what you were finding in studies and what some of our other hunters in the deep south that hunt mountains see specifically. Those rugged areas hold those big bucks specifically during high pressure hunts, and especially where we're at, it's gun seasons because we have most of the southeast states have very long gun seasons. Now, one other caveat because I want to keep staying on like the core areas, the safe areas that they're spending during the gun season. But what is the deer population like in these areas? From a deer density standpoint, because I think that might play a factor as well. So it varies quite a bit. These estimates are after the hunting season. So, one of our study areas probably has about 10 deer per square mile. The two areas up north are 20 deer per square mile, 18 to 20. And the other one in the south, just south of State College here, is probably around 18 to 20 deer per square mile. Okay.
So that's after the hunting season, right? And so we've harvested, 25% of the adult bucks, 40, maybe 50% of the maybe 40 to 50% maybe of the adult bucks, probably on the lower side because we're finding in these large tracts of public land that harvest rates on these deer is actually lower. And then, of course, fairly low harvest rates on 1.5-year-old bucks because of our antler point restrictions. And then harvest rates on does are in the 20% range. So, So we're surveying our deer density estimates at the lowest point of the population after the hunting season and before recruitment occurs in the spring.
So definitely not a super low deer population, per square mile, but That's really interesting. Have y'all ever seen with some of the GPS deer in certain areas of some of the study areas ever crossing paths using some of the same safe areas during that gun season or similar safe areas within distance?
Yeah, we just haven't had enough bucks collared all in the same area to know. But like I said, that 8917, we just happened to have 2 bucks in the same area, and they had large overlapping home ranges. So I'm sure they do. We just don't have enough of the population collared to answer that question.
Also, talk about the terrain standpoint of where these deer are spending a lot of their time during that high pressure gun hunt and gun season. Have you been able to get in there and look at vegetation cover and seeing what that looks like in some of the spots along with the terrain?
We are on the cusp of doing that. So let me back up a little bit. Probably about 15 years ago, I had a student looking at harvest rates of deer in the up on the Allegheny Plateau. So on both public and private land. And so, of course, road access on private land is always much better than it is on public land because a lot of roads are gated and limited. And so he was looking at harvest rates, and he was also looking at hunter density. And so what he found is that on the public land, most hunters were within a quarter mile of a road that was open to public travel. And what he found was that there was this sweet spot for harvesting a deer. So it wasn't right next to the road, and it wasn't really far away. It was about a half mile from a road was the place where a deer was most likely to be harvested. If it had a home range about a half mile from the road, that's where it was most likely to be harvested. And I think that can be explained, but this was back before GPS collars, right? So we had VHF, and basically all we could say is, well, their home range is kind of here. But beyond that, we didn't know any detailed movements. But he could show that deer that lived close to roads and far from roads had lower harvest rates than deer that were in the middle. And I think part of that is there was so much, since most hunters were concentrated near roads, deer who had home ranges in that area moved out. And deer that are far away from a road, they're not disturbed. And then they're more likely to encounter deer that are, in that half-mile range. And so where hunter density was sort of the sweet spot for hunter density, it weren't too many hunters, but there are enough hunters to move deer around and increase hunter success rates. So that was sort of the first hint that there are some factors, and he showed that topography influence, distance to road and topography. So really steep slopes, there aren't any hunters, right? I can't blame them. I mean, these are really steep slopes in places, and far from a road, and it's conflated, right? So usually places far from the road are also steep. But there was that question that was answered. To answer your other question about how vegetation influences, well, what we have to have is a map of the total study area, right? To say, okay, this area has dense understory, and this study area doesn't, or this part of the study area does not, and we're more likely to find a deer here than over here. And up until now, we've never had that map of understory density. But there is, probably many of your listeners have heard of LiDAR technology. So we now have LiDAR technology, which is basically like a radar, or it's a laser, I think, that it just shoots down, and as a plane flies over, it will tell you the elevation at when that signal was bounced back, right? So you can pretty much tell where the ground is because that's the lowest spot, and you can tell the top of the canopy. But if you have a thick understory or no understory, you can also get a sense of that too, because there'll be a lot more variation and scatter in those mid-understory stuff. And so we actually have a grad student who is looking in our southern study areas where we have all this mountain laurel, and between LiDAR and aerial image, satellite imagery, in the wintertime when you fly over our Ridge and Valley region, there's lots of green, and that's not because there's grass growing, it's because it's mountain laurel, which is like rhododendron. It keeps its leaves on all winter. So between the LiDAR and the aerial imagery, she can actually build us a map of understory density. And so another one of my students is going to be taking the deer data and looking to see, I think that you're going to predict if there's more mountain laurel in their home range, they're probably less likely to get harvested during the hunting season. And he'll be able to look at how topography, distance from road, understory density all influences whether the likelihood a deer gets harvested. And so all I can say is stay tuned. I don't have an answer today.
I love that, though. That's exciting. And now I want to ask you, after looking at all these deer in these safe areas and looking at these high-pressure situations when these deer go to these safe areas and really lock down in a general area, what does that tell you from a hunting standpoint? Again, for hunters who are willing to go to those steep areas, is that something they should probably focus on? Is like the rough, rugged areas, the thicker cover, steeper slopes of the areas that they're probably going to want to try to find a buck during that high pressure hunt, an area that they should probably focus on?
Yeah, different strategies. You know, I've hunted the rifle season for, 30 years in Pennsylvania, and I swear it's luck, right? Mostly luck, because we have so many hunters in Pennsylvania that there's so much disturbance that deer behavior is not normal, right? They're adapting to all this activity, and they're adapting to it 2 days before, because, right, what happens 2 days before? Everyone goes to figure out, where am I going to put my tree stand, and flag their tree and mark their territory where they're going to go hunting. It's tough. I haven't been able to pattern deer during the archery season. I mean, I've looked at deer that have really move around a fairly varied terrain, right? So there's a couple of draws that they pass through, and I'd say, okay, is there a place that I could sit where I'm more likely to have that deer walk by me? And I can't see it. I think the strategy is in the right, so I don't know, I don't really know. In the rifle season, I think the strategy in our study areas is to find spots where on the edge of those steep slopes, I mean, you can't walk down those steep slopes. You can't do it. But if you could get to a spot that's on the edge of that, maybe, like I said, we've never had a map of all the understory to see how that might influence deer movements, but maybe we'll have some insights about that. But certainly taking that into consideration, it's tough. I mean, after watching, all the data, I mean, I also know that if you gave me a radio transmitter and said, here's the frequency of that caller, you can go out and see if you can shoot that deer, I know you can't do it, because we have to, occasionally, we have the ability to drop a caller, but our technicians have to get within a couple 100 yards of those deer. And sometimes it'll take them a week or more before they can get within 200 yards of deer. And they have it. First of all, we give them the GPS locations and say, okay, here's the last location of the deer. And they go out there, and then they have a receiver, and because it does have a transmitter, that they can listen to the signal and walk in on that deer. But they have to get within a couple hundred yards where they send a signal that causes the collar to drop off. And they may spend a week trying to get up on that deer. So if you can't do that with all that technology, that's 200 yards isn't even within a rifle shot in Pennsylvania because there's too many trees in between you and the deer. So yeah, I'm not a big source of information on what's your edge on harvesting a deer.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
That's very, very cool. So you know where the deer's at.
It's not fascinating, it's humbling.
That's a better word for it.
Yeah.
That's right. And that also brings me back to the discussion about mast crops and everything. You know, you mentioned that in these big woods areas in the fall, there's just a ton of food everywhere. What does that food look like for these deer? I mean, obviously mast, but is there any grasses or browse or anything like that? What are the deer eating during deer season in these big wood settings?
Well, mast is very unpredictable, right? Oaks. If you could predict oak mast, you'd be a millionaire, but it's just unpredictable. And, you know, some years it can be everywhere, some years it can be spotty. In the wintertime, these deer are primarily browsing. There's not, you know, these are big tracts of forest, 25 square miles. And so if a deer has a 1 square mile home range, it does not have a cornfield to travel to. So in the wintertime, they're eating browse. They might be eating fern roots. You know, these are not highly productive systems. You know, for the latter half of the 20th century, you know, most of these forests were timbered off by the 1920s. And so, you know, in the 30s and 40s, there was lots of early successional habitat, but that's been declining. And you're in stages of timber of, you know, 60 to 80 years in the latter half of the 1900s that does not have a lot of understory to it. I mean, there are places in Pennsylvania that you could see 200 yards, right? Because it's trees that are, you know, 12, 14 inches in diameter and almost nothing in the understory if there's no mountain laurel. But our forests are getting older now. But again, it's not a super productive system.
Okay.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. So my follow-up to that would be, like, what do you do as a deer hunter up here if you're trying to key in on some kind of food source?
Well, I think it depends on the year. If it's a huge mast year, it's everywhere. But oftentimes it can be spotty, like the white oaks might be on, but the red oaks are off, or vice versa. So if you could, you know, find those sources, those might be a good places to set up. But I don't see deer. Well, I don't really know. Again, I don't have a map of oak mast, unfortunately. So I can't say, well, when we have mediocre years, this is what the deer did, and when he had huge mast years. But knowing, you know, other things, you know, like turkeys, we know that when we have a good mast year, our harvest rates on fall turkeys go way down because they're much more dispersed, whereas they flock up when we don't have good mast. So I suspect it could have some influence during the archery season, the mast abundance, but I just don't have the data to show it.
Would it be a good bet that if you were hunting some kind of big woods setting like this, whether you're in Pennsylvania or maybe another part further south in the Appalachian Mountains, that just a good thing that you could go out and look for and focus on is a good understory, higher stem count, something maybe that's not the wide open forest that you're talking about where you can see 200 yards?
Well, during the rifle season, my strategy has always been to find the thickest spot I could, right? You can only see maybe 30 yards, but that's where the deer are going to run to instead of sitting, I don't know, you feel like your success is going to be better where you can see 100 yards, but I found it to be better where I can see about 20 yards. Yeah, to some extent. It depends. Like I said, I'm always coming back to this, right? The archery season is very different from the rifle season. So, I'm limited and I don't have all the answers, unfortunately.
Yeah, two of those blog posts that you did, the hillside doe and then the buck we've been talking about, you posted pictures on the blog about their hiding spots and what it looked like. And to me, both the hiding spots looked somewhat similar. They were next to a steep slope or on a steep slope. They had the higher stem count understory where, you could maybe see 30, 40 yards under there. It wasn't like dog hair thick, but I'm assuming that was thicker than the surrounding woods. Am I correct there?
Yeah, like that doe, the hillside doe, she was almost at the top of the ridge, so you're actually down maybe 100 yards or so. But getting to the top is not easy. The other thing is, and we haven't talked about this, is there's different ways to hunt, and I think drives could be much more effective. That you're never going to sneak up on that doe on that hillside. And like I said, you can't get there before daylight because she's already there at 5 a.m. But if you do a drive and have hunters pass through there and have other hunters set up, then you're going to push them out of those hiding spots. So that is another strategy. But as our hunters get older, right, I think the average age of a hunter in Pennsylvania is 50-something. There aren't as many people that can walk those steep hillsides, right? It'd be a lot easier if one leg was shorter than the other when you're walking those slopes.
Another thing that you've referenced a couple times that I want to tie back to some actually earlier podcast episodes that we have done. We had a guy on years ago, Josh Driver. He's a great deer hunter from down in Kentucky. And one thing that he said that really helped me out when trying to figure out deer and deer hunting was deer don't consciously, we're talking about hunting pressure here, deer don't consciously act, they subconsciously react. And you kind of alluded to it earlier, but I'd like for you to explain the difference between learned versus reasoned behavior.
So it's really easy for us to anthropomorphize, right? Because we can think about the future and anticipate what might happen and make decisions based on what we might anticipate in the future. Whereas my understanding of most animals, for the most part, someone will get mad at me for not saying that, but animals are more reactive, right? And like I said when we first started this conversation, is that these hiding spots that deer have are not something that's reasoned. It's something that they've discovered in reacting to something. So in reaction to all these guys going out into the woods, figuring out where they're going to set up their tree stand, they ran from them and then ended up in a spot where no one showed up looking to put up a tree stand and said, oh, well, when this happens and I run here, then that danger disappeared or never, followed me. And so that's, I think, how the deer are reacting, right? So they're reacting to this hunting pressure. And I think we could learn more about that. Like I said, when I get that map of understory, and I'm really curious to see deer whose home ranges have very little dense understory. Are those deer more likely to be harvested than deer that are close to or most of their home range encompasses this thick understory? So I think that's an important distinction. Yeah, and I think the hunters, your previous interviewee made a good point.
Yeah, that helped me out because, especially when you do a podcast like this, or if you listen to a lot of podcasts where you're always learning new tactics and you're talking to new people who have different ideas, you can maybe give deer a little bit too much credit sometimes. And this is my problem. He gives me crap about it all the time because I'll think myself right out of a good spot. I'll find a good spot and I'll convince myself 5 reasons of why it's not good. And it's usually because of things like that. I'm giving the deer too much credit, oh, they might have figured me out or whatever the case may be. But I just wanted to bring that up because that's a really good point about that. Now, another thing I wanted to talk about when it comes to terrain is, did you ever look at anything around what people would consider terrain funnels, such as large bowls or thermal hubs, saddles, things of that nature, and how deer use those?
I've thought about it, but I'm not sure how I would quantify it, right? So being a scientist, I want some sort of hypothesis and measure it and make some predictions about what I would see. And yeah, it's difficult. I don't think our technical capabilities on the data analysis side are at the point quite there to answer those questions. I guess I could sit and watch lots of movies and try and discern a pattern, but what I'd love to do is build some sort of statistical model that could do that, and we're not quite there yet. And it's actually a little bit beyond my area of expertise, but some of my colleagues and the profession is getting there, right? So we can get locations on deer every half hour for 365 days out of the year. And if you could do that, then you could start to build some models. We aren't even quite there yet with our current study, because even though I told you I can get locations every 20 minutes, I can't do that all year long. So I can do it every 20 minutes during the 2-week rifle season, but then I'm stuck to like a location every 7 hours the rest of the year. So to answer those questions is going to take an incredible amount of data.
Right. And on some of the movies that you put on the blog, I was looking for that in a lot of those. And there was one in particular where that same guest I mentioned a moment ago has something he calls a high crow's foot, which is essentially just up on the side of the ridge where there's maybe 3 small drainages that come together. And it kind of looks like a crow's foot, like 3 small creeks or drainages that all meet in one spot. And one of those bucks went right up into one of those things and kind of meandered around up there for a minute and then came out of it, that I noticed on one of the movies. I was like, oh, that was interesting. Because as a deer hunter, I'm curious about how they approach those and how they use them. Now, did you see anything in your study about how deer like to potentially J-hook into spots versus walking straight into them, or swinging around, doing any kind of unique movements to avoid hunting pressure?
Yeah, so the other thing I don't have enough GPS collars on hunters. Now, we did do that, that study I was talking about with my student who found the sweet spot was like a half mile from the road. We actually asked hunters to volunteer to carry a GPS on their shoulder, and that was in the early 2000s. But yeah, to answer that question, I'd need to know where the hunters are and where the deer are, and I don't have that info.
Right. So did you ever see anything, just looking at the deer specifically, where you ever noticed something like let's say he's entering a safe area, a buck, or a doe for that matter, is entering a safe area where they maybe walked past it and then came back up into it, kind of making a J-hook? Is that ever something that you just noticed as you were going through the data?
Well, I mean, the most intensive data I have is every 20 minutes. And so I have not noticed that, but maybe I don't have enough intensive locations to capture that type of behavior. Yeah, there's lots of things that people ask me, especially about weather and wind, that I can't answer.
Yeah, we had a great conversation with Dr. Bronson Strickland about weather a couple months ago, and he was like, he was explaining how just complicated weather is in general, and trying to quantify that because they just did a big study on weather and moon phase, and it was an interesting conversation. I'm going to actually link that in the show notes if people want to go watch that.
One thing I wanted to bring up, and you might have already answered this question, so the data might not be there, but did y'all ever get a chance to really look at home range shifts from bow season into the safe areas that they go to during gun season, and how far some of those deer might have traveled, or if they were in the close vicinity of some of those safe areas?
So the safe areas are always within their home range. So very rarely do we see shifts. And we don't even see shifts from the archery to the rifle. Well, so things get confusing, right? Because you've got, you could have mast in October, which could affect movements. You've got the rut starts in Pennsylvania around the third week. It starts up by the fourth, things are getting going, and then the first week in November, it's pretty crazy. And then our rifle season is right after Thanksgiving at the tail end of the rut. So these things all confound to try and figure out what it is that's changing deer movements. But some deer shift their home ranges. Just talking about bucks. So we had one buck, his home range was just this oval blob at the very top of a ridge. And then when the rut started, he literally would walk about 1.5 to 2 miles and spend the whole rut, maybe even the rifle season over there. And then afterwards he would go back and spend the rest of the year on top. So there's always something weird that happens with deer, but there isn't consistent patterns, or I don't have enough data to detect them.
That's good good clarification for the safe areas are in their home ranges most of the time. Not very often they're moving outside the home range to go to a safe area. So it's already located in that general area that they're already spending time in. Also, when, and again, you don't really necessarily have the data on mast crops because, of course, that'd be something hard to track. We don't have the technology yet to see how well mast produces in certain areas and if deer shift. But of some of the deer that you've had multiple years of history with, that commonality of that or similarity with their home range year over year in the fall season that's pretty similar no matter what's kind of going on, whether it's drought and or bumper crop of mass or a decline of mass that year. It's always pretty similar.
Yeah, where some deer we've followed for 3 years, and basically their home range is their home range year in and year out, unless they make some strange movements, right? So we have two different females that live 2 miles apart walk up to this one spot and walk back. I don't know what's going on. And they're not even genetically related. So, because we do have able to do some genetic work on our deer. So what's up with that? I have no idea. Or a doe will walk 5 miles south out of her home range and wander back up, and some places she'll walk the exact same path that she went down and never ever see her do that again. So deer do some things that we have no explanation for. But for the most part, from 95% of the deer out there, they have a home range and they're not leaving it, whether it's rifle season or whatever. And then of course there's the rut, which that's everything's off there, right?
Which I'd like to talk to you during the rut, especially in these mountainous areas. How do you see bucks during the rut travel through that landscape? Do they like to run bottoms, hillsides, or the top of ridges typically when they're going on when they're running jaunts? or is it like a little mix of everything?
It's basically their home range on steroids, right? It's just a bigger home range. Like I said, 1 square mile, and then it'll blow up to 2, 3, maybe even 5 square miles. Those movements, slow and steady wins the race. It looks like they're going crazy when I make those movies, right? Because they have this little home range where they're going do 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 just within 1 square mile, and then it's like, boom, it goes up, and really what's going on is they are just walking slowly 24/7. If anything, I would say they're less likely to move at around 4 o'clock in the morning, but otherwise they're just moving all day long during the rut. And so we have bucks over the 4 weeks. The 4 weeks prior to the rut, they might go 20, 30 miles. And the 4 weeks during the rut, 100, 120 miles or more. It's just they're just doing it 24/7, and they're not going fast. And people talk about the heat. Well, Pennsylvania is not Alabama, right? And our breeding season, our does get bred the same time every year. And these deer they're not running a marathon, they're just walking a marathon, multiple marathons. So yeah, there's no rhyme or reason. I had one guy that walked, might even have been buck 8917. Started at 11 o'clock in the morning, went up over 2 ridges, like in 12 hours, and then walked back. So in 12 to 18 hours, he ended up almost exactly where he started. And then he'll go off in another direction. I'm of the belief that breeding behavior of the bucks is driven by who's in estrus. So, right, you have your hunting spot and you observe your breeding activity, and I have my hunting spot and you have and we're all observing different things. And I think it's really the activity that we see is driven by the breeding status of the females in that area, because their home ranges are actually shrinking a little bit. And so in Pennsylvania, we've checked thousands of roadkill doe, literally thousands of roadkill does, to look at when they got pregnant. And antler point restrictions had no effect on it. Age structure of the population had no effect on it. It was the same date every year, which is about half of our does get pregnant by November 13th.
Very interesting.
You can put your money on that.
Okay. Now, also, while we're talking about does, I want to talk about doe movement a little bit. This is something that we had kind of jotted down, because a lot of hunters don't necessarily think about doe movement. They're more focused on bucks, and they kind of put does to the side, especially they're trying to hunt a target buck. What interesting details have you learned about doe movement? You already mentioned like doe home range seems to shrink a little bit during the rut, which I would love to figure out maybe why that could be the case. But what else about doe movement have y'all learned over the years while studying them? Well,
it's very similar to bucks, right? They're the same thing. They're reacting to that disturbance. Our regulations in Pennsylvania have changed over the years. So historically, through most of the 1900s up until this turn of the century, Pennsylvania had a 2-week buck season followed by a 3-day doe season. And so those doe got 2 weeks of education, to the point that I hunted some game lands that had pretty high hunter densities. And by the end of buck season, they would see a hunter and they would like, okay, and just trot off, right? their tail wouldn't even go up because they've been bumped so much, but none of them ever got shot at because all you could shoot were bucks. But that's changed in Pennsylvania. So now our buck and doe, it's a concurrent season during the rifle season. So basically, does at this point aren't much different than bucks. They're reacting to the same thing. They have their same hiding spots. Of course, they're a little bit different in that bucks are solitary, and of course these does generally travel in small family groups. So in the big woods, they're very similar. And of course, we only have single animals, so I don't know how big the family group this doe might be traveling with, so I really can't answer that. But again, in areas where we have ag, a mix of ag and forest, we could have much higher deer densities, right? 30 deer per square mile would not be unheard of, especially, before the hunting season. It could be closer to 35 deer per square mile in places. That you get large groups of doe, that are responding to this and are traveling. But in the big woods area where I'm doing my current research, probably small groups of doe, just like bucks.
Is there been any research done, and maybe y'all have, or maybe you've heard of some research done, that when you see a doe family group or a group of does, are they all related to each other? Is that a possibility, or is it just different does that kind of just come together? Has there been any research done on that?
Well, in general, if you see a group of doe, odds are they're related in some way because during the dispersal period, it's 75 to 80% of the bucks disperse, but maybe only 10 or 20% of the does will disperse. So you have an adult, a matriarch female. Her female offspring are going to establish a home range that overlaps hers. So generally, those females are closely related. However, we did some studies where, we're trapping deer in January, February, March, and you'll have a doe and a fawn walk into bait, and we'll, catch them in a rocket net or a drop net. And you only have a 50-50 chance that those two are related that it's a mother offspring. They may be related, but they're not, that fawn is not an offspring of that doe. I mean, it's only a 50-50 chance. So you can't assume that just because you see a doe and two fawns, that those are her two fawns.
We've heard this. I want to kind of confirm with you. A doe fawn will have a similar estrus timing as the mother. Is that accurate there? As in, that's a genetic trait that they'll get from their mother?
I think that would be really hard to prove. So in Pennsylvania, we have huge variation in fawns that get pregnant. So in our northern tier of Pennsylvania, you're lucky if 5% of fawns get pregnant. So a fawn that's born in June, less than 5% come into estrus and get pregnant during that fall season, that November. But we have other parts in southern Pennsylvania where half our fawns get pregnant, right? So that's a measure of habitat quality. So a fawn has to hit a certain body size in order to come into estrus, right? Because they need to have enough fat stores, body size and fat stores, that they should be able to get pregnant and carry that embryo to birth. Obviously, it wouldn't make sense if they're too small to get pregnant, right? So, and we know that bigger does are going to give birth to healthier fawns, and the healthier a doe and larger a doe is, probably earlier in the year that she's going to come into estrus, which means her fawn is born earlier in the year, which means come fall that fawn is bigger. So I'm not sure how you tease out the genetics from just the physiological differences. I mean, you could, it would take a lot of work. So there's a confounding there. So I'm not sure that, I really think that it's the physical conditions of the doe and the fawn that are more important than any genetic component. And that's the same thing with antlers. So it sounds to me like it's the antler argument just applied to does.
Speaking about antlers, I want to talk about antler point restrictions a little bit.
Okay.
So y'all have a statewide antler point restriction in Pennsylvania, correct?
It is statewide. It has always been statewide, but it varies, right? So in our better quality habitats, it might be 4 points on a side, and other parts of the state it's just 3 points on a side.
So what is the effect of that? Like, for instance, the 4 point on a side, do y'all have a bunch of gigantic 6 points running around now because they can't get shot?
Well, let's back up a little bit. Pennsylvania's always had antler point restrictions. Just that prior to 2005, if it wasn't 3 inches, it wasn't legal. So you'd think we'd be all running around with 3-inch tall bucks, right? Because for 100 years, you could not shoot a buck unless its antler was more than 3 inches long. The thing is, there's so much. Breeding is not dominated by the big antlered bucks that hunting, it's impossible for hunting to affect the genetics, to have any meaningful, if any, effect on the genetics. I know there's work in Texas that should be coming out soon that would illustrate that point as well. So, I would say antler point restrictions have very low risk of having any genetic effects on the population. It's basically, there's more, there's more, we know that there are more older bucks in our population. We proved it because we did a study when we implemented antler point restrictions. We wanted to know what was the survival rate of bucks outside the hunting season, what are the harvest rate of yearling bucks and 2.5 and older bucks, and how does that vary across the state among our management units. So, we went from a state where every year we were harvesting 80% of the antlered bucks who had an antler bigger than 3 inches to a state where less than half of our yearling bucks were being harvested and about 60% of our adult bucks are being harvested. And again, on our study areas of large tracts of public land, we're seeing even lower harvest rates on our bucks. So a 4-5-year-old buck on our study areas is not unusual.
Did you just say that y'all were killing 80% of all the antlered deer?
Mm-hmm. Every year.
Whoa. That's impressive. That's crazy.
Well, other states like Wisconsin did the same thing. Where you have high hunter densities, lots of hunters, you can, and given the breeding, behavior of white-tailed deer, and you have a hunting season, right? Our hunting season is after the breeding season. You can sustain those high harvest rates.
Wow, that's impressive. So in the areas where, or I guess statewide, where the antler point restriction was increased, you saw a better age class of buck. What else did that do? Like, I don't know if off the top of your head you have like any metric like the average score of the buck. Like, did that go up? What are some other effects that had?
Well, I don't keep on top of the buck antler scores, but I know the Game Commission, I think they had an article in their game news that showed that a lot more bucks, right? There's a lot more bucks that are brought in to be scored and a lot more bigger bucks that have been shot all over the state because of antler point restrictions. So definitely it's something that hunters like. We have more bucks, more older bucks in the population because of it. So it's made hunting season more interesting. My game camera photos are a lot more interesting than they were prior to 2005. So
Whenever we talk about antler point restrictions, we always bring up this WMA that Jacob and I grew up hunting in central Alabama, and it never had antler point restrictions when we were growing up. And somewhere in our late teens, they put antler point restrictions on it, and we were upset. We were not happy. We're from Alabama. We like to shoot small deer. We like to shoot deer. And it was probably 2 or 3 years after they put it in, all of a sudden we're like, there's a lot more bucks around here. A lot more big bucks, too.
Well, it only was bad for 1 year, right? Mm-hmm. Right? Because everything was not very big. But then the second year, those ones that survived were now legal. So you were back to where you just had to give up 1 year of buck hunting.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I was a naysayer at first, and then I saw it actually work. And then another thing, we have special opportunity areas in Alabama that are managed by the state that are like a lottery draw hunt. And on those places, they'll have a restriction. It has to be either 16 inches wide or an 18-inch main beam. And we've done several of those hunts over the years, and they are top-notch. I mean, they're fantastic because the state's had a lot of those areas for 5+ years now. So they've really got a chance to implement that. And seeing the effect of that, hunting a property that's managed that way versus hunting another property that's just a couple miles away is really impressive. It's really night and day. One thing I'm curious about is your thoughts on just a straight point restriction versus something like what I just mentioned, like a beam length restriction or something along those lines. The case being that an 18-inch beam or a 16-inch spread in Alabama, that's kind of trying to protect your 3.5-year-olds. Like a lot of 3.5-year-old bucks are going to be right there at that. They're going to be borderline. And so that's the case that the biologists on those places make, is that antler restriction is going to make you think twice about shooting the 3.5-year-old who might make it, but he might not. And so you're going to get more 4 and 5s based off of that. So I'm just curious on your opinion on the efficacy of that versus just a point restriction.
Well, now you're getting more into, social values and what, from a regulatory perspective, what is enforceable, right? So I personally, as a scientist, I don't have much of an opinion. I would just point out that I think that simply counting points is really effective, efficient, and an easy regulation to enforce on a statewide basis. If you want to do the more complicated stuff like you're talking about, where the beam length or spread, sure, that works, but probably on a small area, especially if it's privately managed. If it is a public land, then you're going to have some sort of education of the hunters to make sure they understand what do we mean by, this spread. How do I make sure that I follow the regulations and give them some guidance on it? So it just, those things can make even more older deer in the population. It's just an issue of how complicated do you want to make it, and how easy is it to, not necessarily enforce. Well, it's for a statewide regulation, it has to be enforceable, right? So it has to be clear cut that this was a violation, and you're getting into this gray area when you're asking hunters to assess the spread or the beam length or something like that, as opposed to counting points.
That's an excellent point. And also, kind of like you were mentioning, that leaves a little bit of headroom with the regulation where, maybe the state implements this that's going to protect the younger age class of deer, and then if landowners or land managers want to ratchet it down a little bit more on their own places, they can, but you're not really subjecting the whole population to that.
Yeah.
Because that was my criticism with antler point restrictions to begin with, is like, well, if this guy only gets to go out and hunt one time per year and he wants to shoot whatever, like, let him shoot the thing. And if you have a property that you want to manage for trophy bucks, if that's what you want to get out of hunting, then manage your property that way. But like you said, an antler point restriction, as long as it's not too restrictive, you only have 1 or 2 years where it might be kind of rough on people like that before the herd kind of catches back up and gets healthy again.
Yeah, the other thing you have to keep in mind is that, right, in our area, I said the buck's home range is 1 square mile and could be 5 square miles during the breeding season. So how much land do you have to own where you do your regulation and the other guy does his own? You're going to have to own 10, 15, 20 square miles in order to not have your bucks killed by someone who has different ideas of how they're going to manage their bucks. So I know people in Pennsylvania who had a lease of maybe 6,000 acres, right? So that's huge, right? That's almost 9 square miles. They implemented antler point restrictions themselves, but it wasn't until Pennsylvania went statewide that they actually saw significant improvement in the size of their bucks, even though they had always been doing it on their property. And that's just because, buck movements are so, the buck doesn't know that they're managing it this way. If they did, maybe they would stay on his property where they have to have a, 18-inch spread or something like that. So it's clear that in Pennsylvania, I don't think anyone owns enough land that they could manage it differently and see a huge benefit without having those statewide regulations.
Mm-hmm.
What is the, because this kind of goes with antler point restrictions, but just a background. Do you know what's the hunter density across the whole state, roughly per square mile? Do y'all have that data or rough data on that?
Well, the National Deer Association puts out that report every year, and they would have it. But 600,000 deer hunters and 26,000 square miles. So, right, you could, if counting Philly and everything, that's 24 hunters per square mile or something like that.
Whoa.
That is so insane.
So in some places it feels like there's one for every 2 acres, but yeah, that's what it is when you average it all out.
Gun season, this state looks like a pumpkin patch. All the
Yeah.
orange.
That is so surprising.
But see, we used to be 1 million. So hunter numbers are declining drastically, yeah.
Culturally wise, in Pennsylvania, I've always been fascinated because, at least in my general little research looking at it, it seems like Pennsylvania has always was one of the top 2 states, and not the top state for the most hunters statewide. Is there a cultural reason behind that, of why there were so many hunters, or has been so many hunters in Pennsylvania versus any other states that have similar populations and size?
Well, the big states are like Michigan, Texas, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania really are the top states. I think part of it is, so you have to go back well over 100 years. By the late 1800s, there were very few deer in Pennsylvania. Most of them were in the north central region, which we call the Big Woods, which is basically north of State College up to the New York border. In fact, currently there's about 2 million acres of public land that's either Bureau of Forestry or Game Commission owns, and then there's 600,000 or 800,000 of the Allegheny National Forest just to the west. So at the low point of deer populations in Pennsylvania, most of the deer, if you wanted to go hunt deer, you went up into north central Pennsylvania. At the time, so we logged that over, huge fires, I mean, hundreds of thousands of acres a year burned, lots of early successional habitat. Those lands were abandoned after we stripped all the timber off them, and that's why we have all our state forests up there. So our 96% tracts of forest were denuded 130 years ago. But part of that, when we instituted those forests, there was no one. If you wanted to hunt deer, you had to get a train and get as close as you could, and then probably hire a wagon, horse and wagon, to haul you up to go hunt deer. And so Pennsylvania started this tradition of hunting camps. And so on our state forest lands, there are lands that are leased. They don't issue any new leases now, but historically they leased plots of land where people could build a hunting camp, a camp. And so there are strong traditions of people traveling to north central Pennsylvania, and you can look at maps. I've made them of southeastern PA. They'll go up to Tioga, Susquehannock State Forests, and the Pittsburgh people go to the western side of the Susquehannock and maybe other state forests. So there's a long tradition of people going to hunting camp. And so that's probably part of the reason why there's a strong hunting tradition here in Pennsylvania. The other thing is that this is the sweet spot for white-tailed deer. We have fairly productive habitat. We do not have severe winters. Our deer do not yard up. So we have very little winter mortality. Fairly long growing season. In some places, 50% of our fawns are getting pregnant. So very productive deer population. So that's probably another reason why we have a strong hunting tradition, because it's a great place to grow deer.
That's fascinating. Okay. Our buddy, Bo Martonic, he's north here a few hours, and he's always talked to us about that hunting camp culture. And we're not, in the Deep South, it's nothing like that, hunting camps. There are some families that have something similar, but it's not widespread, that culture and tradition of hunting camps. So it's interesting to kind of hear that. Now, you're talking about the super productive deer population in the growing seasons, and that all makes a lot of sense. What is the effect on understory vegetation because of those deer populations? I know you've studied some of this, but what has been looked at there from a food to mouth standpoint and browse standpoint in some of these wooded areas versus more mixed agriculture and big wood settings?
Well, we could do another 2 hours on this, but the problems of too many deer and its effect on forest plant communities has been written about in Pennsylvania. I have up in my office a booklet that the Bureau of Forestry wrote in 1930 about the deer problem. Aldo Leopold, who's the father of wildlife management, published a paper in 1947 documenting, overabundance of deer across eastern North America, and there's plenty of places in Pennsylvania where that was a problem. So historically, very few deer in 1895 when the Game Commission was created. By the 1920s, there were people in the Game Commission warning us that we were going to have too much deer. and by the 30s, forestry was having a problem in parts of Pennsylvania with its effect on tree regeneration, and that carried through. And then there's, in more recent times, beginning in the 1960s, all the way through 2000, excellent research that studied the effects of deer on forest understory plant communities, especially here in Pennsylvania. A lot of work was done by the Forest Service up in northwestern PA, where you guys are headed. Nancy Tillman was the first one. She published a paper in Ecology in the 1960s about the effects of deer on plant communities. In the 90s, the Forest Service did an outstanding study where they had plots of, they had different densities of deer, the range of deer densities that occurred in Pennsylvania, and they maintained those densities over time and showed that if you exceed about 18 deer per square mile, then you're going to have negative effects on forest plant communities. And since then, so that study was done in the 90s, there are follow-up studies that show that because of the different deer densities, you get a different overstory and structure and plant community of trees, that in turn influences the bird community species there. So there are ripple effects that carry on through decades of what the potential that deer can have on our forest communities. Now, when Pennsylvania implemented antler point restrictions in the early 2000s, at the same time they reduced deer densities, right? Because first of all, APRs were going to result in more deer. And I published work in the late 90s that showed that our deer density estimates were about double what we wanted, right? The Game Commission had deer management goals for deer densities across the state, and they were basically double what they thought should be there in terms of, balancing, maximizing deer for hunters, but also protecting, reducing deer vehicle collisions and minimizing impact on our forests. So when we implemented antler point restrictions, Pennsylvania also increased antlerless harvest, and we reduced the deer population by almost 25%. And that had a huge effect. So in places where you clear cut and you'd get fern, you started to see regeneration. But that's where my research that I talked about in the beginning came about, because the first thing that comes back is birch, and then you see the things that deer like to eat still kind of struggling in the understory. And so our question was, well, there's some interaction here between the soil conditions, the deer that are eating it, and the other plants and how they compete for light and nutrients, that maybe we need to be looking at this rather than just focusing on deer, try and take a bigger picture to find out what's going on. So I would say today we are way better off in Pennsylvania than we were 25 years ago. But we still have a lot to understand about how deer herbivory impacts forest plant communities and the ripple effects beyond.
Interesting. So thinking of this in terms of a southerner, it's like the deer, your disturbance, I guess, regime for certain, I guess, oaks regenerating or what, maples. Basically what's happening is, if I'm understanding this correctly, is the birches are the first things that come up. They're a fast-growing tree. And then you have other things.
And deer don't like to eat them.
And deer don't like to eat them. And there's maple and other things that are coming up that deer do like to eat. And so every time that maple shoots up, deer nips it off, and then the birch keeps growing. And then before long, the birches crowd out everything else. And then all of a sudden you have a birch-dominated forest?
Yeah, it's even more complicated than that. But, I mean, that's one possibility. I mean, people have hypothesized the reason we have so much mountain laurel in our oak hickory areas because deer are eating everything else, and that's the thing that can grow. But we're finding that we're not finding much evidence for that at all. So it's really complicated, right? So the reason we have lots of oaks is because we lost the chestnut to the blight. And then when we cut down all our forests 100 years ago, they burned, and that's ideal for oaks. But now we're not burning anymore, right? We put out the fires, and that means in the understory, the red maple does the best because it's this sort of average tree that can grow in every condition. And so we're not regenerating our oaks, but the red maple is doing great. So it's really complicated. And I think that's where, our deer research needs to go to better understand deer's interaction with the forest because, for over 100 years we've blamed everything on deer. And the Game Commission has come a long way in improving that balance. And I think we're at the point where we need to ask the questions of, I know we're at the point of how do we better understand this system so we can make better management decisions? Because it's not just deer.
As a point of wrapping up, I do want to talk about just the history of the chestnut real quick. I think it's something that maybe a lot of people don't know about, but it's very interesting that a lot of the eastern United States used to be covered with an American chestnut, and that was a major food source for deer, but also people, livestock, and all kinds of stuff. So what was the American chestnut and what happened to it?
Well, the American chestnut is a native species to Pennsylvania. It's huge. I mean, if you look at old pictures, you'd think it was a redwood tree, gigantic. The other thing, as I mentioned, oaks, their mast is unpredictable. An American chestnut they produce chestnuts every year. And it's probably tremendous source of food for passenger pigeons, bear, deer, everything. Even, that we have it's not a rat, but it's called the Allegheny wood rat that lives in our ridge and valley in these talus slopes. And those species they're functionally extinct in New York and New Jersey, and they've been struggling in Pennsylvania. And I think one of the reasons they're struggling in Pennsylvania is because we don't have American chestnuts everywhere. The Allegheny wood rat has a very Catholic diet. It eats berries, leaves, fruits, nuts, mast. But when those American chestnuts rained down chestnuts every year, they could gather them up into the crevices in the rocks where they lived and survive. So the loss of the chestnut is huge, had huge implications for Pennsylvania forest. So when we go out and look around and say, we're losing our oaks, well, we already lost the chestnut. The oak is not original. It was not the dominant tree species, 100 years ago.
So what happened to the chestnut?
Well, the blight, it's a fungus that was introduced from Asia. The Chinese chestnut is resistant to it, but the American chestnut has no resistance, so it's wiped it out completely. Now, they are trying to restore it, trying to use genetic techniques to perhaps introduce that gene from the Chinese chestnut or other things, but it's not going well. It's going to take, I think, some time, but I would love to see the American chestnut restored. Not only was it a great nut, but the wood is awesome to work with. So I'm a woodworker, and I have a little bit of chestnut that I've able to acquire, and it's a beautiful wood to work with.
Yeah. There's still, you'll see like remnants of it throughout the woods sometimes. Like even down in Alabama where we're from, you'll find stump-sprouted American chestnut trees where the original tree is killed, it's dead, but that stump sprout keeps coming back. And I think it's the American Chestnut Foundation, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
You can actually, if you find something like that, you can snip some leaves off and send it to them, and they do something with it, genetic testing, I'm sure.
Yeah, hoping to find something that's resistant. I mean, I've never seen one. In Pennsylvania, it's common to go out in the woods and you'll come across the husks, and there might be a tree. They get maybe 8 inches in diameter, and then they succumb to the fungus, and yeah.
Yeah, there was one of those in Alabama. A good friend of mine in Alabama talks about his dad or his grandfather used to go up in the mountains up above where they live and would gather chestnuts, and because it was all chestnut forest, even down in Alabama back then, and they would use it to feed their livestock. And now that's where I've found some of those stump sprouts in the past, but. It's once you learn about it, it's like a huge bummer. You're like, man, that sounds awesome. I can't. We missed out on that. So hopefully it can come back. Are they trying to cross like a Chinese chestnut with an American chestnut to make it resistant?
Well, there's a couple of different groups, and I'm not a geneticist, trying different techniques of trying to somehow introduce resistance to the fungus, and yet retain the structure, because a Chinese chestnut is not a grand tree, right? It's more like an apple tree. Doesn't grow very tall, but the American chestnut, I mean, they could be 10, 15 feet in diameter and hundreds of feet tall. They were huge, massive trees, and completely different structure. So yeah, I mean, they can cross a American chestnut and a Chinese chestnut, but you don't get the American chestnut, that beautiful, tall, straight tree. And that's the struggle, is to keep all the characteristics of the American chestnut, but just make it resistant to that blight.
Do you have any idea how they're doing with that? Is it going good? Are we getting chestnut?
It was going good the last I heard. But you'd have to check out the website of the American Chestnut Foundation. I mean, they have plantations all around where people plant trees to see if they're resistant to the blight. And I think they were very hopeful, but I think they've had some setbacks recently. But they just need more support to keep going.
Well, we'll give them a plug here, American Chestnut Foundation. Check them out.
Yeah. One last note I had was you were talking about in the 20s, not to jump back from chestnuts, but when we were talking about the detrimental effect of overpopulation of deer with forested areas and vegetation, is in the 20s some people were starting to write about overpopulation of deer and having an effect. That's a huge difference. That also gives me a better idea of why y'all have such a deep-rooted whitetail hunting culture and tradition up here with hunt camps, is most of Alabama didn't really have deer until the 70s. They were completely wiped out, and they started doing restocking starting in, I think, in the 50s and 60s, but there wasn't a great huntable population to the 70s and 80s. So, like, we're tremendously set back from where you guys have been at for a lot longer period of time, which is interesting. But that's fascinating. Again, I think our Southerners, they went to killing a bunch of deer back in the 20s, or actually before then, and really wiped out a lot of the population, because we had to bring deer in Alabama, I know, from I think it was 6 different states, and then there was one small population in southeast or southwest Alabama where they started doing the restocking program from, and took them forever to do that. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, but Pennsylvania, keep in mind, we didn't have deer everywhere in the 20s, right? It was localized. And if you look at the Game Commission harvest maps, you can plot their harvest by county from the early 1900s all the way through today. And you can see the expansion of deer. So that's the other thing, is that not as many people travel to those camps, because now they can just hunt deer in their backyard, literally. So the number of deer, over the course of the past 100 years has changed drastically just within Pennsylvania, too. So there were parts of Pennsylvania that probably didn't see good numbers of deer until the 40s and 50s.
Okay. One other thing I do want to ask you about, because you said there is a hunting population decline in the state. We're at 1 million or over 1 million hunters now. You're about 600,000. What is your thoughts and reasoning why that could be the case?
Well, my colleagues and I, we published a paper a couple years ago about that. It's going to be a challenge for deer management in the future. Part of it is the aging of baby boomers. So if you look at the age structure of hunters, like I said earlier, the average age in Pennsylvania is in their 50s, mid-50s. And that's just getting older. And so, but it's not just the baby boomers aging out. What we see is, well, that is a big problem, right? So once we see someone hits about 65, they're less likely to hunt deer. And so we have, if you look at the age structure, we have this big bump of baby boomers that are about to age out of hunting. But if you look at all hunters across all age classes, you see in Pennsylvania, we do have some mentored youth, but basically you cannot mentored youth hunting opportunities, but you have to be 12 years old to be able to buy a hunting license. So 13, 14, 15, 16, you see increases in numbers, or 14, but even at 16, 17, and 18, it starts to decline, probably because kids are very involved in sports. Then it's declining into their early 20s, and it's not until early 30s that you actually see no decline or perhaps a slight increase, which is probably people who have kids and maybe they're old enough to take hunting, so they may be engaged in a little more hunting. But almost every single age class except youth that are starting, and fewer youth are starting to hunt, almost every age class we're seeing a decline in loss of hunters. So there's less recruitment of young hunters. There's less retention of hunters of almost all age classes. And then there's the aging out. So all three of those factors. Now, why that is, there's lots of, there's just so many things to do. I always say when my daughter was in, and she's an avid hunter, when she was in high school, she said, "Dad, it's still light. The time change hasn't occurred. I can hunt after school, right?" And I was like, "Yeah, other than Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, what day do you have time after school to go hunting?" So, I think that's a big part of the recruitment and retention. And I think it's a big challenge for the profession, which is going to mean that we're going to have to think about, if we're going to use recreational hunting as a way to manage deer populations, we're going to have to think of ways to increase the efficiency of hunters and increase their interest in harvesting more than one deer.
That's what I was going to ask next, like from a population standpoint of managing the deer herd, what could take place? And you were talking about efficiency and maybe even bumping up numbers of deer from a harvest standpoint and giving more people more opportunity because there's less hunters. Yeah,
the problem is most hunters only want to harvest about one deer or 1.1 deer or something like that. So we need to, make it easier, but that's complicated because we have chronic wasting disease. So, do we want to be donating meat you got to make sure it's not a disease or it's not detected in the deer. Having a deer process is very expensive. So, states are trying to have programs where it's free. If you just want to donate the deer, it's processed for free. I don't think they've been very effective. Virginia has implemented programs called Earn a Second Buck, which I think has the most incentive. I'm not sure Pennsylvania still has a lot of hunters, but Virginia does not have a lot. It has the same problems we do, but it doesn't have nearly the number of hunters. I mean, probably less than a third. But what Virginia does is if you harvest an antlerless deer, then you can harvest a second buck. So, a lot of hunters out there are only interested in harvesting an antler deer, but they can harvest a second one if they harvest an antlerless deer. And that's been pretty effective for Virginia, as well as trying to engage, local municipalities to encourage hunting and that sort of thing.
So I'll say this. There are people, especially on social media, they never come up and talk to us, and they're not even really, say, big listeners or viewers of the podcast, but are anti getting new people into hunting. It's more, I feel like a selfish thing, specifically guys who are trying to focus on specifically trophy hunting whitetail bucks. They don't want more competition, whether they're hunting private land or public land. Do you have any thoughts on that, or your perspective from a deer management standpoint with that perspective?
Well, I can see where they're coming from. I mean, as a bird hunter, if you think deer hunter numbers have declined, bird hunter numbers have way declined, and so there's way less competition for finding the grouse coverts, right? And so that's a good thing. But yeah, so humans are pretty selfish people, and it works pretty well, right? They call it the selfish gene, but I think we have to take the long view. If this is a tradition that's important to us, we as hunters need to be relevant to society, because the decision to allow hunting is a social decision, right? We have agencies that their responsibility is to manage the species, and society can decide that maybe hunting is not the thing to do. So, and hunters, as our numbers decline, may become more irrelevant to society. So it's not going to do us well in the long term to think selfishly about hunting and hunting opportunities and sharing space and recreation and that sort of thing.
Also, a caveat for those guys who are the trophy hunters who don't want other people to get into hunting, I'd love for you to just touch on the effects of not harvesting enough deer, too many mouths to feed, and also when it comes to antler production, that doesn't equal well for antler production, correct?
Yeah, so let me just add a caveat is that, we haven't really defined what you mean by trophy hunting. So, and the public doesn't generally look kindly on trophy hunting. But it's not trophy hunting or not trophy hunting. It's obviously a large antler deer inspires people to hunt, and for some reason it just triggers something in the human psyche, right? They're really cool. My colleague, one of my colleagues, says she has a love-hate relationship with antlers because they're really cool things, but there's too much focus on them. So I just want to qualify that there's all different types of quote-unquote trophy hunting. But the thing about deer is that we can have extremely high harvest rates, as I mentioned earlier, on bucks, and it has no detriment to the population. But if you're going to manage white-tailed deer, that means you're managing the female side of the equation. If you're just shooting bucks, you're not managing white-tailed deer. So that is a critical component that ensures the relevance of hunters and hunting to society, and it ensures that we have a sustainable, ecosystem, whether it's farmland or forests, It's critical that we think and that hunters think more about the antlerless side of the equation. And to that point, think more about it to maintain that we are relevant to society as providing a service while at the same time having a recreational opportunity that, millions of people in this country enjoy every fall.
We've appreciated the conversation and also your honesty on some of those conversations, and also how widespread your research has been. It's nice to kind of see everything that you've done, and we've just barely touched on a lot of it. Like you said, we could have sat here for another 4 or 5 hours probably discussing more details. And maybe at some point, get that mapping cover system built out to see the understory cover. Love to maybe try to get y'all back on and see what y'all find there as well. But appreciate the conversation. Thank you for letting us come up here and do this interview with you and sit down with you.
Thank you. It's been a fun conversation.
Perfect. Well, all the viewers out there and listeners, thank y'all for watching and listening to the podcast, and we'll catch you back here on the next episode from the Southern Outdoorsman. And remember, guys, y'all stay Southern.